Mommy Snoopy, A Story of Distance by Wendy Mahonen. I'd like to tell you a little bit about my inquiry paper and project, which is called Negotiating Distance Through Dialogic Communication Ethics. This explores my changing relationship with my son Joe and is truly a labor of love. I hope you enjoy it. This is my son Joe, my Snoopy. From the time he was a baby, about the age that you see in this picture, I've called Joe my little Snoopy, which is my term of endearment for him. I used to love to hug him and kiss him and pinch those chubby little cheeks.
Mom!
Joe and I have always been really close. He used to voluntarily tell me what's going on in his life, and he was always eager to spend special Joe and Mommy time together. That was then. This is Joe now. He's 12 years old and in the 7th grade. He enjoys his middle school and loves baseball and can be so moody at times.
Mom!
I know Joe still loves me just as much as he did when he was a little fella, but he doesn't open up like he used to, and he doesn't seem to need me as much anymore. When I try to dote over him, he just becomes irritated. One of the concepts I've learned through my graduate studies is about distance. Not physical distance, but interpersonal distance. I find the concept fascinating, and I wanted to explore how understanding distance and managing it effectively could improve the changing relationship between Joe and I. So, this is our story. The picture on the left was taken on Joe's first birthday. We took him to get ice cream and to swing at the park. Back then, he loved to sit on my lap and constantly wanted my attention, whether it was to run and play with him, to read with him, or even just to snuggle. Flash forward several years, and you have the picture on the right. Joe's in middle school now, and everything has changed. He no longer wants any part of snuggling with me. He becomes irritated when I try to dote over him in public, and sometimes even in private. He rarely wants to tell me about his friends or even his girlfriend, and it seems like distance is the last thing we need in our relationship, right? Before we dive into talking about distance, let me share a little bit about mothers and sons, both from my research and from my own personal experience. First, like me, many mothers are extremely close to their precious little boys when they are young, only to become frustrated and even sad when their son grows older and act like mom is the most uncool person on the planet. However, it's important for moms to remain confident when this happens. Research shows that empowered mothers are an integral part of their son's identity, and the relationship influences how he approaches manhood. Many mothers fear distance primarily because they don't understand its power or its purpose. Like any relationship, a mother and son relationship requires an ongoing dialogue to remain healthy, which is why I think it's important to view distance through a dialogic communication ethics lens. The point is to learn something new through engaging in dialogue. So now let's talk a little about distance and what it means in this particular context. First of all, distance is not equal to physical proximity. Distance in this situation means the interpersonal distance or perspective in a relationship. Often mothers like me who feel they're drifting away from their precious little boys when they reach puberty try to misuse interpersonal skills to decrease distance. This is a mistake. Distance isn't a bad thing and can actually nurture a relationship if used properly. The important thing to understand is that mothers can and should renegotiate distance with their sons as they reach their tween years. Remember, distance is necessary for a healthy relationship and is what makes a relationship distinct and unique by each person valuing the other without demand. So now let's get into the actual paper. Here I'll tell you a little bit about my research, what I studied, how I went about it, and why I think it's important. Let's face it, research can be just a little bit dry, so while I'm talking about the research and why I decided to examine distance and how I went about it, instead of just going through the dry words and showing you some words on the screen, I decided to post a few of my favorite pictures of Joe for you to look at while I'm talking. So as I mentioned, my relationship with Joe has changed, and I wanted to determine how or even if distance could help improve the mother and son relationship. Other scholars have focused on parent-child relationships, and I discussed several of these in my literature review section of my paper. I wanted to focus on distance and the mother-son relationship when the son reaches his tween years. I decided to use the works of Carl Rogers and Martin Buber as the basis of my research. Both scholars' work focuses on empathy and relational distance and the importance of accepting others exactly as they are without trying to impose our own wants, demands, or personalities on the other person. I thought this was key to understanding my own parenting style and my relationship with Joe. I used the dialogic approach to communication ethics, which is basically using dialogue as a vehicle to learn something new. To develop my research and analysis, I performed a textual analysis on two interactions between Joe and I. One was an argument, and another was a conversation during one of our Joe and Mommy outings, although I'm not allowed to call them that anymore, in which each of us discussed something we thought was important. So let's talk about what I found. Using the interactions as our text for the analysis, I learned several things about distance in our relationship that could extend to other relationships with moms and their tween sons. First, distance can actually help with the silent treatment, but you have to know how to use it. Instead of being angry or acting hurt, mom should simply ask if their son wants to talk. If the answer is no, let him know the offer stands, but don't force a conversation. When I did this, my son called me into the room to talk about what was bothering him a little while later. The next thing to remember with distance is that parental boundaries matter. I'm Joe's mom, not his pal or his BFF, and he wants me to act like his mom. The next thing I learned is that distance can help prevent arguments, but you have to use distance at the right time and in the right way. The key is for moms to treat their sons like a unique individual instead of an extension of themselves. This is extremely hard. It was definitely hard for me. Giving them space is critical at this age, though. Another thing I learned about my research is the importance of dialogue. I talked to Joe about our relationship and asked for his help in conducting this research. By acknowledging that we need to renegotiate the terms of our relationship, I showed him respect. In a few years, we're going to need to discuss and renegotiate our relationship again. It's an ongoing process and one that's really important. The next thing, moms should embrace distance, not fear it. Negotiating distance isn't just important, but it's an ethical responsibility. If a mother values her relationship with her son and wants to keep it healthy and positive, distance is extremely powerful stuff when mothers use it properly. So now what? You've heard the basics about my research and a little bit about my findings, but sometimes seeing is believing. So let's look at a couple of examples of distance at play. First, we'll see an example of what it looks like when you're not using distance appropriately, and then we'll see an example of when distance is used appropriately. The first one, I'm barging into Joe's room, and you'll see what happens.
Mom.
And here's a good example of distance.
I love you, Mom.
As I mentioned, I find the concept of distance fascinating and probably could have gone on and on and on with the research, but I needed to focus it for the purposes of this project. So let's talk about some other future research. Some things that people might be interested in, or some future possible research, would be to focus the relationships and distance between a mother and her tween son, but use strictly the principles that Carl Rogers set forth about helping relationships. Another way that you could go with it is to use a little bit different methodology. I focus strictly on my relationship with Joe, but someone, if they so chose, could examine several pairs of mothers and sons and get kind of a comparative analysis and see what they found there. Another thing that someone could do is possibly examine distance in other types of relationships. I toyed with the idea of examining distance in my relationship with my husband, or maybe even my sister who's grown, or my parents. So that's some other routes to go with examining distance. Finally, I want to give a nod to all the scholars who I cite in my paper and whose research helped guide my research. And here are a few more. Finally, I want to thank my son Joe. Without him, none of this would have been possible, and I really appreciate his help and cooperation and hope that he learns something about our relationship too. And no matter how old he gets, he's always going to be Mommy's boy, Mommy Snoopy.